Hey everyone, so this video is going to talk about poverty and its role on development. So in recent years, psychologists have really been working on discovering the possible effects that living in poverty can have on a child's social and cognitive development. And just as a definition, the Child Poverty Action Group from the UK defines poverty as having 60% or less of the median income in the country. And other countries may compile this data in a different way, but what we found is that it cannot be disputed that children growing up in poverty will have a difficult childhood with many possible consequences. And this could be short-term and long-term, even possibly after they are in a state of poverty. And this could affect areas on child development. This could include education, which would be cognitive, health, biological, and then community. And we're going to talk, which would be sociocultural. And we're going to talk about these in greater detail as we go through this section. So often what we found is that it is not poverty itself that is tied to poor outcomes for development, but rather it's the ways in which poverty impacts the emotional and cognitive supports within your life that impact our development. Even with these lessened resources, what we found and what psychologists have found is that there is a lot of resilience in children that can be found from coming from a poor background. But having less resources, having less money can affect the things that you need to continue to grow on pace with other peers who may not be in poverty. And as far as research goes, a few things have been staples of research on poverty. And so in order to isolate the effects of family income from other components of poverty, two methods end up becoming widely used. The first one is the statistical separation of effects, and then natural longitudinal experiments. Statistical separation of effects use complex statistical methods to mathematically isolate the effect of one particular variable. And they are achieved by analyzing patterns of correlation between multiple variables and subtracting out confounding effects. And they end up becoming largely illustrated with a three-circle Venn diagram, where you are looking at one particular variable and then looking at potentially another one as well. Natural longitudinal experiments, of which we'll see one or two today, these are research studies that investigate how a naturally occurring fluctuation of family income affects the development of children. And you cannot manipulate the poverty of someone in a given situation, especially over years. And so that's why it's called natural. And so if poverty really affects development, then we should observe some correspondence between fluctuations in family income and fluctuations in the rates of child's development. So in terms of education, statistics have consistently shown that children growing up in poverty are disadvantaged in terms of educational progress. At even 3 years old, children with lower socioeconomic statuses are already 9 months behind developmentally behind their peers. That's almost a third of your life at that point. By the age of 14, it's 2 years behind. And children with free school meals, which are provided for children needing financial assistance, these kids often attain lower grades in school. So they have a 1.7 grades below their wealthier peers. So where their wealthier peers on average might get an A, for instance, they're getting a C+. And this is all due not to the natural abilities of the child, but because of the lack of emotional, cognitive, developmental supports. And like I said, these are due to a few factors. For one, it's lower attendance rates. These hurt the child's ability to keep up with lessons, which hurts cognitive abilities and development over time. So I think LeBron James, who grew up in an extremely poor environment, he said, I think it was third or fourth grade, it was one of the two, that he had missed almost 140 days of school in his fourth grade year, right? And if not for other people that were looking out down the line, where would he have been? Because to miss that many days, I don't know how much you could pick up from what's going on in class. Also, what's hurting children from impoverished background is home life in some situations. And this is not all, but in some situations, children from poor backgrounds are more likely to have home lives that are less stable, less conducive to education. They may have lower levels of cognitive stimulation in the household. Things like books might be in shorter supply. Educational programming, educational games. The family just might not have money for that sort of stuff. And even though parents may do their best to provide a developmentally appropriate home for their child, the resources, again, may not be available. And this is more likely the cause of a lot of these sorts of shortfalls. Also, food and nutrition, which depend on one's circumstances and level of poverty, may be most important matter in someone's life. And so school and cognitive and social development may become afterthoughts as well. When I taught in South Carolina, there were a ton of kids who were extremely poor, and some of whom I knew did not probably eat dinner when they went home that night. And, you know, when I look back now, I can't say I blame someone if they don't do their homework in that situation, or if they're not able to focus in school. I know for myself, if I'm hungry, you know, even for a couple hours, it becomes a lot harder to do work. And so those things hurt learning abilities in school and for the long run. Also, parental modeling might be affected as well. Based on the parents' views and experiences with school, they may have had hard experiences or bad experiences in school themselves, and that may be passed on to the child in terms of how they influence the child. And having positive role models, whether you're in poverty or not, is going to be so important in developing positive habits towards school and continuing the cognitive development that occurs in school. And unfortunately, you know, even where parents are very good, maybe they have to work nights, and so there's no one there with the child to sort of work on them with stuff. All of these things are effects on education. So this leads us into the what's called the UK Millennium Cohort Study. This from Dickerson and POPLI in 2016. And they wanted to investigate correlations between multiple variables associated with poverty and cognitive development. So they took 19,000, so huge sample, UK children born in 2000 and 2001. And it's a longitudinal study. They used interviews and standardized cognitive tests. And then they used the statistical separation of effects to analyze the data. And they used 4 sweeps where all participants were tested at the same points of time. And that's at 9 months, 3 years, 5 years, and 7 years. And then information at each sweep was collected at face-to-face interviews with the parents and cognitive tests used to assess cognitive development of the child. So what they found was that before the statistical separation of effects, children who experienced poverty had lower scores on standardized cognitive tests. This is before they sort of, you know, factored out or factored into account certain variables. The timing of the poverty episodes was also important. Most recent episodes of poverty had the least impact, where the family, maybe the father or mother got laid off at work and suddenly they're in an impoverished situation. But being born into poverty had the largest impact on cognitive development. And then after they did the statistical separation of effects, family income had an effect on cognitive test scores over and above what could be explained by other variables associated with poverty. And so there was a direct effect of income on cognitive development, right? And growing up in a fair world, you would hope that this would not be the case, that something like money, some things that we cannot control, would affect our own cognitive development. And then at the same time, a number of pathways were significant in predicting cognitive development. And so it found that providing educational opportunities and resources was shown to be more important than interpersonal interaction between parents and children. And we saw another study with this, with the Oportunidades program in Mexico. And so there are other studies that could sort of help us in our understanding of the role of income on our educational attainment. And in conclusion, poverty does have a detrimental effect on the cognitive development of children. The earlier it occurs, the stronger the effect. So being born into poverty can oftentimes largely affect the developmental potential of the child. And that is Dickerson and POPLI. As far as health and poverty goes, there is also evidence to suggest that living in poverty is also likely to affect an individual's health adversely. At birth, children of low-income families weigh less than average, more likely to also be born premature, and also more likely to die at birth. These are, staggering statistics in terms of the effects of poverty on individuals and humanity itself. The lifespan of the poor is also less than someone who is not poor. And then there's also a greater incidence of disability and chronic illness in children in low SES households. And so according to the World Health Organization, poverty creates ill health because it forces people to live in environments that make them sick. You're more likely, let's say, for instance, you live in a poorer neighborhood. You're more likely to have to live in places that have been deemed to be, less desired than other people who can afford to pay more to live other places. And so you may be living closer to a factory. You may be living closer and away from, waterways, or away from trails to run and walk on. All of these things impact our health. And then in terms of child development, poor health affects attendance in school. So if you're always sick, that would be hard to go to school with. It also affects brain development and cognitive development as well. And these have far-reaching implications for the future. So that leads us into talking about a study that I briefly referred to earlier in the video, and that's FERNALD and GUNNAR from 2009. So they wanted to investigate the effect to which participation in poverty alleviation programs affects the level of cortisol in young impoverished children. And as we talked about, cortisol is used to overcome the effects of stress, but having too much cortisol in the system shows that there's too much stress on the body, which can make us more sick. So they had 554 children in this experimental condition, and they had a team of researchers that visited the families at home and conducted the following measures. One was a 1-hour interview with the mother, and they were assessed on a depression inventory. 25 to 40 minutes of cognitive tests administered to the child or children, and then cortisol measures or cortisol levels were measured via saliva samples at 3 specific time points. So as far as results, they had children who had been participating in the program that showed lower salivary cortisol levels than children in the control group. And so the program really showed effects on children with intensely depressed mothers, but not to the same extent on children of less depressed mothers. And so providing these supports can help to overcome some of the negative effects of being in an impoverished environment. Things like after school programs, things like additional resources at home really helped the child cognitively and socially, and also health-wise too. And then in conclusion, participation in this poverty alleviation program can have significant positive effects on stress levels, which in turn affects our own health levels. And here's an evaluation. We've talked about these before. Um, and, we want to sort of look more at this second limitation because it potentially lessens the usefulness of research, because if the positive effects on a poverty alleviation program are only apparent for intensely depressed mothers and the children of those mothers, then what strategies might work better for mothers with mild depression that might become worse over time, or those who have very low levels of depression? How do we continue to push these findings forward? So in terms of brain development, it goes without saying that healthy brain development is influential in the ability of the child to have normal development. And so if the child is affected by a lack of resources, then the important needs of the child for healthy brain development are not met. They may suffer from insufficient production of new brain cells. The brain may not be able to follow the healthy trajectory of maturation. Brain circuitry could be affected, all of which could affect learning and our ability to continue to grow. And so this affects our cognitive and social development. Because it affects our ability to function in the classroom and social environments. And so we might be able to be less able to process information, less able to regulate emotions, which are important for our continued success within society. And then as far as the sociocultural viewpoint on poverty, I mentioned this at the beginning, but communities also impact learning and development based on communities. So, two important effects of growing up in an impoverished environment and neighborhood is safety and less opportunity to play. The first one in terms of safety is that, feeling safe is really something that we need to feel like we have stability in our life and to continue to allow ourselves to grow and feel like we have the necessary capabilities to grow. And because there is more of a competition for resources, and because a lot more people are turning towards violence in these areas because of the lack of resources needed to survive, it may help children, or it may hurt children in terms of feeling that security and feeling like those needs are being met so that they can focus on things like learning and continuing to grow. Also affected are opportunities for play. Greater vandalism, illegal activity, danger of injury, like older and more broken down playground equipment, could affect the ability of children to play. If there's a fear that this is a violent neighborhood and certain times of the day are off limits to go to the park, then that affects the ability of the child to go outside and play, especially in urban areas where there might not be a backyard to go play in. The ability to stay close and to play and to do those things that we've talked about before help children so much in terms of their cognitive growth and social growth are in play here. And so the basis for this is based on what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And instead of going through these next two slides, I'm just going to go over to the visual here. and just talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in essence, right? And so Maslow thought that there were 5 different need areas that a person needed to continue to grow, right? And it started at the bottom. And just in terms of how we read this, if your needs at one level are being met, then you cannot climb the pyramid, right? So the first one came physiological needs, the need for air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, okay? And so a lot of people within poverty, or at least some, are not having these basic needs met. And so their ability to continue on to the second level, which is safety needs, personal security, employment, resources, health, property, if these are not being met, then feelings of love and belongingness are also not being met. Now think about this. We've already talked about how these 2 needs right at the bottom are issues for those in communities that are highly impoverished. And so their chance to continue to grow socially and cognitively is harmed on the basis of not having these 2 needs met. After safety needs are love and belongingness, friendship, intimacy, family, a sense of connection. The next one is esteem, respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, and freedom. I would say most people probably tap out at this level, right? They are struggling to have that sort of esteem, not only just self-esteem, but feeling esteemed for by others. Because only 1% of people ever get to this last level, and that is self-actualization, the desire to become the most that one can be, and the ability to fulfill one's own human potential. And this includes very successful people who feel like they have done everything that they've wanted to do on Earth and have truly maximized their human potential. People like Oprah, different athletes like Michael Jordan, President Obama, people that have really expanded and gone beyond what most people are able to do with their lives, because it takes so much esteem to be able to be not fearless, but as courageous as they've been in terms of going after their dreams. So that's going to lead us into our last study that we're going to talk about here. And this is Costello et al. From 2003. We've talked about this before. It's called the Great Smoky Mountains Study. It is a longitudinal study that was trying to investigate the effects of changing poverty status of the family on social development of children. And in this study, they were studying 1,500 rural children between the ages of 9 and 13. 25% of the sample were Native Americans and 75% were white. This was a longitudinal study, so they studied them over several years. And halfway through this experiment, the children that they were studying went through a change because there was a casino that came to town. And so some children who used to be poor were no longer poor, 14% of the study. Some remained poor after the casino. This was 53%. And then some were never poor, and that's 32%, relatively at least. And so what they studied were the psychiatric symptoms that were compared. And so what they found was that before the casino opened, the poor children in the first 2 groups had more psychiatric symptoms than the never poor group, right? And this wouldn't just be based on genetics, but from the stressful environments that they're living in. Remember that we talked about how this was a part of how genetics for psychiatric symptoms like depression ends up being exposed. After the casino opened, the psychiatric symptoms of the ex-poor children dropped to the level of never poor children. But this was only true in terms of externalizing behaviors. So even though they were no longer like kicking walls or being aggressive, they may have still had things like anxiety and depression that just weren't being externalized. And so the conclusion you can make is that since the family characteristics did not change, but the level of income in the household, the symptoms and the reduction of externalizing behaviors may be attributed to changing financial status. And so poverty affects development at that time. And family income has an effect on social development of children over and above other associated variables. All right, so at this point, if you have any questions on poverty and development, please let me know. Other than that, I hope you all have a great day.